Hello, everybody. This is GW. I am really happy to have you here. I hope you're enjoying this. I hope you have followed, subscribed, do everything that you do down below. I saw there that most people listen to this for about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, then they turn it off and then they do whatever it is they do. I know I do that myself with a podcast, so I encourage you to listen for 2 or 3 minutes before you turn it off. This isn't going to go on too long, maybe 10, 12 minutes at the most, not that much to give up in your day. And you know what? We're talking day 70 of government thoughts, my government thoughts of my government. I tell you, it's really, really tough out there right now watching what's going on. And I think that no matter who had been elected, I think that you could come up with these same type of complaints and worrisome activities that are doing. But let me say this: everything that is being done, almost everything, at the larger levels, maybe not down at the granular levels, but at the 1/50,000 foot level. When you take a look at that, everything was pretty well laid out in the Republican Plan 2025. And if people had read that and actually paid attention to it, they might have been able to get a little bit of a grip on this as they do this. But take that as just a beginning thought. Everything here that is happening has been planned out. Everything. So, how are we doing? Well, I was talking to some friends of mine. I have friends. Some people do. Anyway, these folks are very conservative, very much Republican, very much right leaning, very much kind of wonder what the hell I'm doing down here in the area of the world that I live in. But here it is. But their opinion of what's going on in the administration is that it's doing a great job and that it's finding. I had a guy look at me and says, "Can you believe the amount of waste and fraud that is being dug up?" And I got to tell you, I don't think it's very much. I mean, just because you fire 20,000 people doesn't mean that they were wasteful and doesn't mean that they were fraudulent. It just means that you decided to fire them en masse. So I find that interesting that people really do think that the administration is doing a great job. Now, they admit that the administration, particularly on the economy, is taking big swings, and that those big swings, if they work, they are going to be tremendous for everything on the economy. And if they don't work, they're not going to be quite so tremendous. But they admit that they're taking big swings. So that's interesting too. That they're not completely sure everything's going to work out, but they're not opposed to taking the big swings. Now, we talked about this before, that we're trying to run the country like a business. I mean, they looked for corporate sponsors for the Easter egg hunt on the White House lawn. Corporate sponsors. Really? You got to make a profit on an Easter egg roll? Unbelievable. Unbelievable to me. So the court actions continue. The administration will, of course, fight back, and that's to be expected, and they should. They should fight back, and they should go into the courts, and they should be able to defend their positions. Now, from my point of view, they have been having trouble doing that, but that's beside the point. It's the rule of law, and as long as they let that go and they let it work, and it works its way up to a Supreme Court that they have stacked, well, then so be it, as it goes on. What I'm afraid of, and what has been shown a little bit, is that the administration is just going to ignore the courts. And that would be a catastrophe. Then we have a constitutional crisis, and that's tough. But what we have right now is we have a civic lesson, and I am all for having a civic lesson and having people work with that. Now, the other thing that we're having a civic lesson on is Trump continues to float the idea of having a third term. And he always caveats it, well, I don't even know if I could. Yeah, I think I could. I don't know if I could. Well, he knows. I mean, everybody in the United States know that the president has 2 terms ever since FDR. Now, before FDR, it was unlimited terms, but FDR was elected 4 times. Good reasons. Great Depression, World War II. Not a great time to change leadership. But after that, they put in an amendment that said 2 terms. So to have Trump floating the idea of a third term, and, in all honesty, when the election comes, he may or may not depart. It's going to be interesting. Now, the administration is also seeking sanctions against the attorneys and the law firms who worked against Trump in the previous administration. Now, that's interesting. Lawyers work for people who hire them. So to say that these firms were so wrong because they were hired by people against Trump when Trump was a defendant, I don't understand. But a couple of the law firms have caved and given him money, and that's scary. Now those law firms, I gotta think that the reputation of those law firms is toast, and that it's going to be a hard road for them to continue. Now, another thing that is happening is our allies have been putting out travel advisories about setting foot in the United States. Now, our State Department has always put out travel advisories for places where it was either unsafe or at a war zone, or where people, American citizens, would be at risk because they were American citizens. So to have our allies, well, I guess they were allies, putting travel restrictions on the United States is pretty embarrassing. And when you also add on to there that we're thinking about, actually floated the idea of, do we need to be in a leadership position in NATO? And well, that's interesting, because if we're not in a leadership position, then I think that is step one. Step two is that we leave NATO. And if we leave NATO, then NATO is going to be greatly reduced in its efforts to stop any type of incursion from Russia or China. Now, Russia primarily with Europe. But my goodness, I mean, that is just, when you look at cause and effect and you look at down the road what might happen, what this might mean, that's pretty scary. Okay, now we are starting to see some of the effects of the DOGE actions. We're starting to see in the Park Service where they're not able to do things, and they're already closing parks, and they're closing portions of a park for the summer activity. You have a great many of the parks where just getting in and out of the park is now a serious problem. So it's going to be a really depressed year if you want to spend the summer going to the national parks. Really unfortunate. Our Social Security Administration, of course, taking it, absolutely getting hit on and trying to do that. I personally, at an age where I have Social Security, and I needed to, for whatever reason, but I needed to call in and to get a form. And A, calling in was impossible. B, when I went online, I went through 2 or 3 windows, and then it said, whoop, not available. And this continued for several days that I was unable to do it. Never did, by the way, get the form I was looking for. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it is in dire straits right now. So now the other thing is the Department of Education, of course, has been abolished. And so, what do you do with that? Well, one thing that comes to mind, there's lots of things the Department of Education does, and let's be honest, people have been floating that idea that the Department of Education could be done without for several administrations back. So this is not a new idea, but this is just forcing it, and it's just the matter of how they do these things. So when you sit there and you have that, you have one area that comes to my mind quite quickly: student loans. Well, you have to. I mean, there's a lot of student loans out there. Very common for a person to get through college or other things and have student loans at the end of it. So somebody has to administer those loans. Well, apparently they decided that, okay, the Department of Education isn't going to be here anymore. So we're going to move the administration of those student loans to the Small Business Administration, which makes some sense, except that they had just fired 40% of the staff at the Small Business Administration. So even if they bring all the staff from the Department of Education with them to administer the loans when they get there, as they try to embed themselves in the Small Business Administration, which you can't lose 40% of an agency without having just a severe growing pain type activities. I mean, people are just not going to be sure who's doing what to whom when. So when you take all that into consideration, that is, again, just a criteria for just catastrophe. So we also have found that they are cutting the food shipments. Okay, now cutting the food shipments, I mean, we all remember USAID and cutting all the aid and all the activities and the things were helping with vaccines and all that in the third world and in Africa. But these are cutting food shipments that were going to food banks in the United States. So they're cutting food shipments to help people in the rural United States. So really makes you wonder why. And then they cut so many people at the National Weather Service that they've had to either eliminate or modify the number of weather balloons that they put in the sky. Which you go, well, what does that mean? Well, apparently they launch a surprising number of weather balloons on a very regular basis. I had no idea. I really had no idea. But that's how the information they get from those balloons is how they are able to predict the weather as well as and as accurately as they do. So if they can't have a good prediction of the weather and what's going to happen, then you're going to have more and more problems with the activities that go on when, okay, well, sorry, we could have given you that information 6 hours ahead, but I hope that 5 minutes was enough time for you. It's going to be interesting. We also have, the AARP has finally come online a little bit because they're worried about the Small Business Administration or the Social Security Administration. So when you look at all these things together, the polling numbers for Trump is down compared to what they were in November. But, you can read the poll numbers to say a positive thing because they're actually higher than they were at this time in his first term. Interesting poll numbers, but it really does put, wow, what is going on out there into a perspective. You also have activities that are going on that to fill the cabinet seats and to fill some of the other positions Trump convinced a person or two, I think two, to resign from their seats in the House of Representatives to become part of his administration. Getz down in Florida was one, and Waltz, Mike Waltz, I believe, the defense guy. He is another. Well, come to find out, they now have special elections that are coming up, and the Democrats and the non-conservative folks in favor of Trump are making enough noise that it's a little concerning to the Republican Party, to the point that they're having people. The lady that was going to be nominated to be the UN ambassador has been pulled back so that she doesn't lose her seat. That's how thin the Senate and the House majority is for Trump. Hardly a resounding mandate from the people when they got to worry about whether or not one or two or three seats is going to lose them the majority. So what else do you have? One thing that you had, I haven't even talked about the migrants to El Salvador. I can't even think about that. That's just awful. But what we have here is, I think most everyone is aware of the story about the emperor who had no clothes, and how some little kid was finally the only one who sat there and said, hey, dude, what are you doing? Run around naked. And so the same thing in my mind is where we are with Trump. We don't have anybody in his inner circle who can pull him aside, lean into his ear, and go, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? A good example of that is the Kennedy file releases. And he was at the Kennedy Center and he announced, hey, we're going to do this. Now, he had mentioned that he was going to do it before, but I don't think that anybody prepped for it. And I don't think that anybody thought that he was going to do it with a totally unredacted file. But that's what he did. And he said, and we're sending them out and it's going to be totally unredacted. And so they did. Nobody that I'm aware of, nobody that was reported in the press, went to the president ahead of time and said, not a bad idea. It's been a long time. I mean, why not get these files out there? If there's no good reason not to, I mean, why not get them out there? And B, let's have one quick scrub to make sure that there's really nothing in there that would do any person any harm, or any government agency any harm, or any whatever they could convince them of. Well, what happened is the very next day, the files were released. Must have been sitting in a box ready to go. So they released them. They sent them out. And then they found out that most of the redactions that had gone out in the previous version, because very few new documents came out, they were Privacy Act violations. And Privacy Act, even though those files are very old, people were still alive. So now the Social Security people have to catch up with all these people and have to give them new Social Security information as they make it so that they can't have their identity stolen. But the files are out there now. People are probably having their identity stolen as we talk. So that's where we stand. We got an emperor with no clothes and nobody willing to tell him that. We've got activities going on across the country that are being underreported. I mean, there's there's a lot of reporting that are going on, but really not much that is making it to the mainstream news. The evening news that goes on at 5:30 or 6:30, depending on what time zone you live in. Those activities are just not being reported too much. So that's my government thoughts for day 70. I hope you enjoyed them. The good news is we still have a country. The even better news is that starting to see more and more activity, resistance going on to the administration. And the bad news is that the emperor's still out there with no clothes. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this. I enjoy doing this. Going to get back here pretty soon, talk about the yard woes that I have every year. I got to tell you, had one this morning that don't even want to talk about right now. So I'm GW. Have a great day. Please keep this in mind. I'll keep sending out these little comments every now and then. Hope you enjoy them. Thanks a lot.